Today's seminar. It is my great pleasure to welcome our own Ann Chen for her visit to the Institute. While Ann is very much a known quality and a very much valued colleague, by means of introduction, she obtained her bachelor's degree at USDC and then went to Stanford, where she got a master's degree and a PhD in geophysics, and then also spent some postdoctoral time there. And after that, she moved to UT, where she joined the Department of Aerospace Engineering as an assistant professor, and she's now an associate professor there, but also affiliated with the Jackson School of Geosciences, where she has struck up many exciting collaborations. Her research really sort of runs the gamut from tectonic to hydrological problems and everything in between. She's an expert in the analysis of radar data, and she just told me that, if the radar interferometry signal is simple, she gets bored, and she prefers the challenging problems where the goal is to tease out the most information from the spaceborne observation with exciting results. She's going to talk to us today about work with colleagues here and elsewhere on the study of the earthquake cycle using InSAR and coral-derived surface deformations. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you so much, Thorsten, for the introduction. So I'm Ann Chen, and although right now I'm in aerospace engineering, I'm really a geophysicist because you can see my training is in geophysics. So that's kind of a saying, nowadays, everything is cross-disciplinary, and hopefully from the talk today, you can see that this radar science research is really interdisciplinary by nature. As Thorsten said, I arrived at UT in 2017, so that's 8 years ago, and I think. And so I have to admit that back then, I was very, very worried because as a brand new assistant professor, the biggest concern I had is will I have some new ideas? Like now I have no longer had an advisor, told me what to do. Like I'm on my own, facing an empty office, doesn't have any furniture. So what am I gonna do? Turns out, like if you go to a good place and you met all the colleagues, and then there's just gonna be a lot of interesting ideas that spark out of the lunch break through seminars. And so I assure you that it never was an issue. So this talk was based on so I gave a talk back then in 2017 on a hydraulic groundwater study. But after that, Fred Taylor reached out to me, and he was very excited and showed me a lot of his work, decades of work in Solomon Island. That's kind of the beginning conversation of the project that really leads to a very, very interesting area that I'm very excited to work on with Luke and people. So I'm happy to share the story, how this thing just started from, kind of a new person, joined the team and was able to develop. And I want to emphasize this teamwork, and a lot of the result was produced by the two students, Lauren Kendall and Memo. And so, this work is together get funded through the NASA ESI program that is awarded to me, Luke, and Laura Wallace. Yeah, so I'm gonna get started. So before we dive into the particular project, I want to give you a little bit more information about who I am and what I do. So if you go to AGU, there is a few aisles that is geodesy, right? And so that's where my home domain is. So what is satellite geodesy? So it simply means you're trying to observe and measure quantity information about the Earth from space. And one of such very first example, and I'm showing here, is a very famous photo. It's the blue marble that taken from the Apollo 17 mission. So simply you put human on Earth, you take a picture, and it's gonna be very, very different from what you would just see what the Earth looks like on the ground, right? But you don't always need to put humans there because we don't have a lot of people that can go visit. That was privilege, right? And so you can also start to put different sensors on the Earth. And the easiest thing is to put a camera in a satellite instead of a human take a picture. You have those optical satellite cameras that take picture to do that. So you see a lot of this image from Landsat that runs multiple generations with decades of image that track what is happening on the Earth. And in UT, this is actually one of our very strong area. So we have UT Center for Space Research that has been dedicated for developing new different remote sensing techniques to learn different things about the Earth. And one of their flagship mission, GRACE, is such example. So what GRACE does is they have like two satellite that is forming in formation, kind of flying together, right? And what a UT Aerospace engineering is good at is orbital determination. So using some word, they really know where the things are in the space, right? And that allows them to be able to accurately measure the distance that between these two satellites as they fly over. This subtle distance change was actually due to the change of the gravity field as a relatively change. And turns out those gravity field change, majority of them are leads to like a hydrology signal, that mass of water moving from ocean versus and vice versa. That's why this GRACE mission turned out to be a useful mission for hydrologic study. And so what I do is different from that. So I'm a radar scientist. So I often tell people we look at the Earth using those fringes, and these fringes can tell you very detailed information of the Earth's surface topography and surface motion. And how it works. So here I gave you a illustration, right? And so at a time one, the satellite will fly over an area of interest. And periodically, it will send a pulse onto the side. So those imaging radar, they're side-looking radar. They don't directly look down. They look sideways. Just think about if you have a flashlight, instead of looking directly down, you see dots, right? If you look sideways, you image swath. And that's why as you fly over, it scans swath of the Earth. And periodically, it will send out pulses, and then each of the ground surface pixel will return an echo back to the radar. And at every pixel location, you contain two pieces of information. So the amplitude information tells you how much amount of this energy was scattered back to the radar sensor. And when you piece them together, like there are many, many pixels, you get a like grayscaled image that is complementary to the optical image. You can see where there's a volcano, there is a land, there's ocean. And this kind of data set has been used for like a flood mapping detection, land survey, land cover mapping, and also tracking the grounding line of the glacier, and also tracking those fast-moving glacier and the landslide. And also, the satellite pixel also contains the phase information. But unfortunately, because of the radar and microwave sensors, so the surface scatter, the target they're thinking of is on the order of a centimeter. So the radar pixel, typically, we're talking about this technique about a spatial resolution of tens of meters, right? So within each pixel, there are many, many, many this centimeter level scatters. And so the phase you get from each pixel is actually a collective return of all the scatters. And because the surface, what starters looks like, where they are, if you have a grass patch versus tree, those are random. So for a long time, the people focused on those amplitude image because you look at the phase, it just looks like a broken monitor, right? It's all random. And so, but the things that become more interesting. So if you have a satellite that are orbiting the Earth, right, at another time, or maybe you have two satellites flying over the same area of interest at the same time, they make another image, right, and so of the Earth, and at the same pixel, you received another measurement of the amplitude and the phase. And now if you're taking the difference between these two phase measurement, and suddenly they no longer looks like a noise. So they start to have those nice, pretty fringes that looks like some sort of data. And why do we suddenly have this coherent data, right? And so it turns out, and if the surface has remained stable between these two times, so the surface scatters all kind of remain in their relative position, so you will have this phase difference, then they're actually was measuring the range difference that happening between these two circuit time vision time R1 and R2, right? Because of that random distribution, it's the same scatter, they moved a little bit, and the phase difference is sensitive to that difference, while you have no information about the absolute one. And so This is a simplified geometry. So basically what we can learn here is the phase difference between phi1 and phi2 can be seen as a proxy of this range difference between R1 and R2. And you also know the satellite position accurately, as we know. There are great scientists, they do the orbital determination where they know where the things are. So you know S1 and S2. So you could actually just plug in the things you know. You also know the baseline. And so that's the distance between S1 and S2, and also the relatively orientation between with respect to the horizon. So there's a lot of angle here in this picture that you know, right? And with some magic math, mostly high school math, the trig identity, many trig identity that link all this geometry. But the short answer is that you could link this phase difference to this topographic height, what we call the Z here. So that is the surface topography information. And so this is this radar interferometry was developed in the 80s. So that's the very first application they were aimed for. They're using this techniques for mapping high resolution 10 centimeter of global topography mapping based on trig identity. So basically that's the answer. And we then had this mission that was launched based on this design that's called SRTM mission that was launched in 2000. It's a NASA-led mission. So in this configuration, you can see in this mission logo, there's a space shuttle. That's where they put the radar on. It was onboarded on a shuttle. And you can also see there is about let me point to that. Like this very, very long rod that is about 60 meters, right? And at the end, there is a radar receiver because, well, you need a two measurement and you have a baseline. So that's how they make this configuration into in place. So this SRTM data has delivered surface topography data at a 30-meter resolution from north 60-degree latitude to south 60-degree latitude. And this data is still commonly used nowadays. And I think I want to just mention it's very impressive because this SRTM, guess what? They collect this large amount of topography data. Because the radar was able to illuminate a very wide swath, you're talking about tens of kilometers to hundreds of kilometers within a single flight. The entire data acquisition for collecting such data only takes 11 days. So that means you can have many, many measurements over a very short amount of time. Right, now we have the topography data available globally. So consider this scenario. Between these two SAR acquisition time, this land surface also moved a little bit, probably because there's an earthquake or volcano or there's some aquifer pumping. So, this R1 minus R2 will be also sensitive to this additional motion on the surface delta T along the radar line of sight direction, right? And if we have a topography, we know the satellite geometry, you could compute what's the topography phase contribution in that InSAR measurement. And by subtracting that, you end up be able to use the same techniques to measure a centimeter level deformation. When we're saying centimeter is because each of the phase cycles, they can be converted to line of sight deformation by a factor of 4 pi divided by lambda. And for L-band sensor, this lambda is 24 centimeter, which means each phase cycle is 12 centimeter of deformation. C-band Sentinel data, 5.6 centimeter wavelength, which means each cycle is 2.8 centimeter of deformation. And we have X-band data from DLR, German Space Agency. Each cycle is 3.1 meter X-band data. And so that's 1.55 centimeter of deformation. So that's why this is a technique that is really, really sensitive to very small deformation, right? And so I often tell people, what do? We measure deformation. This technique enables you to be able to see if you have millions of GPS stations on the ground that was recording what is happening on the Earth. So most of the, we have SRTM data. There's another mission that was doing topography mapping, but majority of the InSAR mission you'll hear about, they're dedicated for mapping surface deformation. So here is a chart, and you can see we have such data available since 1992. A lot of the early mission was launched by InSAR, that shows in the middle, ERS-1 and 2, and ENVISAT. And I want to mention the year 2014 is one of the game changer year. Because on that year, Sentinel-1 mission that you probably heard about is still in operation with launch. And the key difference between Sentinel-1 mission and the earlier InSAR mission is that a lot of these earlier InSAR missions, especially the one launched prior to 2011, they orbiting the Earth every 46 to 35 days. So the coverage, that's what's the temporal coverage they have. So usually in a year, you maybe get a 10 data set, right? And because of the improved antenna design, they can make a much wider swath for the Sentinel-1 mission, which means that they take a fewer repeat to cover the entire Earth. And that allows us to have data every 12 days at every land pixel on the surface. And then they have two satellite constellations, so they have two antenna design. They're orbiting the same area. So that effectively enabled the many part of the Earth. They have data every 6 days. So this data, like before, you have data, maybe 4 data set, tens of interferogram. From this a small scale analysis now translated to you have 10 years of radar data, has hundreds of SAR acquisition and 10,000 or even more interferogram, right? Because you do those pairs. So if you have a 2 SAR acquisition, you get 1 interferogram. But if you have 3, you get 3 interferogram. You get a lot more, it's and choose 2 problems. So you get a lot more interferogram. Suddenly, a lot of the big data analysis, the statistical analysis become feasible. So that really you start to see people was able to do things that they are not able to do. And what makes it more exciting, last July, InSAR mission, that we've been waiting for that for a long time. In fact, when I was interviewing here, I was telling people it's going to be launched next year. It didn't happen for a long time, but finally, this mission is in orbit. So they launched the satellite. Right now, it's in the science data collection mode, and the data will be available in late February, in March domain. And so we're going to have this L-band InSAR mission that has this wide swath capability. We're orbiting the Earth every 12 days. And so it's just like decades with a lot of imaging radar data. And I want to mention this. Sometimes when you have a field that has suddenly start from no data, very poor data, to tons of data, right? They're talking about petabytes of data. And so there will be a lot of opportunity to be able to see things that happens on the Earth that has never been seen before. So it's an exciting time for InSAR research. So give you an example of what such data looks like. So here is an L-band ALOS data. So L-band, I picked the L-band because it's the same wavelength of InSAR data over the Solomon Island region. So this interferogram was formed using 1 SAR things acquired before the April 1st, 2017, that's a magnitude 8 earthquake, and 1 things right after that earthquake. So the pair spans the earthquake, and all those fringes contains the surface deformation that occurred due to the earthquake, and where the epicenter is let's see. The closer land surface is Vona, the epicenter is around this area. So, and you can see that from this area, those are radar fringes, phase fringes. So every time you see a pink to pink, that is 1 phase cycle. And we mentioned for L-band sensor, every time you see a pink to pink or green to green or yellow to yellow, that means a phase cycle that is equivalent to 12 centimeter of line of sight deformation. And you can see that there are many, many fringes here because it's a large earthquake. It caused a meter level of deformation here. And you can also start to see that in the Vona area where you're more close to the epicenter, the fringes become denser, right? That just means the rate become higher and higher as you move close to the epicenter. So such kind of a postseismic deformation has been actually routinely used for earthquake studies. So the very first interferogram that contains the earthquake was published in 1992, right shortly after the launch of the first InSAR mission, and that's the ERS mission, that's the Landers earthquake. So that one made it to the Nature's front page. Why? Because that was the very, very first time people can see an earthquake with such detail. So with all those fringes and this spatial distribution from space. And even if you have the best knowledge with the best ground instrumentation, it's very, very hard to predict where you're going to place them to get such a detail. So that was a big shot in 1992. But nowadays, such data was routinely used for earthquake analysis. And but you might wonder, like, since it's like a routinely used, so where this project is coming from? Because I mentioned, Thorsten mentioned, where I have a particular interest on data set that is very hard to deal with or in region that is under surveyed. And I want to mention, well, the InSAR study has been used in many areas, but for the Solomon Island, that co-seismic InSAR observation was one of the very few that was published in InSAR observation over that area, right? And if you zoom out a little bit over this whole region that is heavily under surveyed by InSAR, so that was the ALOS mission was launched in 2006, and so there's no Sentinel really comprehensive Sentinel mission. So it just doesn't look like people had interested to that, right? But that's kind of odd because if you look at this area, this Solomon Island, and along with the Papua New Guinea region, this is one of the most active subduction zone in the world, right? And so we have, so here on this, this is a figure that was made by Laura Wallace, and you can see those black arrows that indicate those GPS campaign surveys about the convergence rate of this plate boundary, and also this focal mechanics marks that shows you some of the recent large earthquake. So you can see this is a very, very active earthquake, and you have this very high convergence rate, and also the subplate, they have rotation, they are very complex behavior, and create a lot of earthquake. Even after we got funded, there are several large earthquakes occurred over this region. So should be an ideal laboratory for subduction zone analysis. Why nobody is doing that, right? And so that's kind of how we decided we're gonna give it a try, and we're gonna try to see if we can construct a better surface history over this region. So to understand why this is difficult for InSAR analysis, and there's not much going on other than we know there's a co-seismic information by the time we start the project. The issue is, it's relatively easy to generate an interferogram that contains surface deformation due to a large earthquake. Most of the geophysical processes that usually produce signal that is much, much, much smaller. And many of them are probably a centimeter, sometimes even a millimeter over a short period of time. And in a lot of the subduction zone, you might have to wait for maybe 10 years even to get some detectable signal. So in general, majority of the signal, especially the associated with the interseismic signal or postseismic signal, all due to smaller earthquakes, their signal magnitude is small. And once your signal magnitude is small, start to see that you're trying to estimate a deformation from space, and that satellite altitude is 700 kilometers above. There are many, many things going on to introducing noise that would be bigger than the signal you're interested in. So here I outlined some of the majority signal noise term of the data. So the very first one, especially this is prominent in the early mission, is orbital error. Apparently, you don't know where the satellites are. You don't have enough a flight control system as time goes on, and your satellite can diverge from your planned orbit. Then that would lead to an error, right? But luckily, aerospace engineer, they did a lot of great work. I start to see this kind of issue less and less. They seem to be able to control where the satellite are at a centimeter level position and all. So this become less a problem. So the second noise that is usually hard. So those are like, sometimes people reach out to me. They said, I want to do something. I ask where they are. I want to look at it. And I tell them, no, this is going to be very difficult. I'm interested to look at it, but don't expect I can give it to you like next week, right? So the next problem is that because of the radar measurement that contain those surface topography information, right? And you need a DEM to remove the topography. And so in case your DEM is not accurate enough, we have the 30-meter level DEM. And also in this steep terrain, right? Like Himalayas, this kind of area where you have a very high elevation. So when you are using an imperfect DEM and trying to remove the topography signal, then they might have a residual noise that just due to the topography residual. So usually not a big issue unless you have a very, very high slope angle. So what my experience, if you're Hawaii, there's a shield volcano, they're fine because the slope is pretty gentle. But if you're dealing with a Everest, that kind of topography, then you have to be a little bit careful about the second term. But for majority of the other term, like study, like one big contribution is atmospheric delay, and the next one is called vegetation decorrelation. So that already kind of happening in like most of the site I study. Why? Because atmospheric noise is everywhere. Our Earth is surrounded by different water vapor and things like that, right? And the atmosphere, they have a two-component ionosphere plus tropospheric noise, right? And so those are the noises that is a big issue. So I'm gonna first illustrate to the last term, the phase decorrelation. So what is phase decorrelation? As I mentioned earlier, the primary foundational assumption for InSAR to work is that surface pixel remain unchanged between the two SAR positions. So if between these two times, some road service folks decide to pave a new road, right? If the farmers decide to plant some corns that has grown from seeds to like high, like the matured corns, or like if there are forests that dropped leaves, then essentially it changes the scattering property of the surface. And that would violate that assumption that put InSAR to work at the first place. And when large disturbance at the surface happens, so you no longer have those nice fringes, looks like what happens on the right? And what you end up having is what you have on the left, the phase start to return to this spatially random signal that doesn't have anything you could analyze it. It's like I can probably just simulate some random phase, and that would just looks just like that. So when phase decorrelation happens, essentially there's nothing you can do, right? And the reason we're using L-band is because it has longer wavelengths, which means if there's smaller like disturbance, and it might be looks like a huge disturbance to a shorter baseline interferogram because the tolerance is usually within a phase cycle, right? And if you have X band, even a centimeter of a change would be a huge thing. But for L band, 24 centimeter, it can tolerate a little more change, right? And so that is why if you have a very densely vegetated area, and you're going to have this phase decorrelation because vegetation changed over time. And in such a scenario, L band typically works much better than the C band data, right? And so here is an illustration how this vegetation decorrelation works. And we have actually ways to measure it directly from data. That essentially what you do to quantify this noise is add this data set, you draw a box anywhere in centered around the pixel. You look at how random it is. So if for the picture on the right, if you draw a box here, you can look around and say, hey, all the face looks like a green pixel. So they're very similar in space. So you have a high coherence. So it's a formula you could derive. And on the left, like you draw a box, you see all the face here looks entirely random. And in this case, you get a score of 0. And here is the correlation score for two interferograms. One is 1 day apart, one is 60 apart, right? And as expected, the correlation tends to drop over time because the longer you wait, the more change that can happen on the surface. And also the decorrelation also correlates with the land cover, like in the water, because of those surface water structure change within seconds. So usually you don't get a good measurement. So those InSAR deformation mapping mission are land mission mapping mission. So they don't really have a coherent signal in the water region. Usually the techniques works really well in bare rock, like those Hawaii volcanoes that has a sparse vegetation. Now this area, the coherence is not going to be a problem. You're going to expect all this X-band and L-band sensor perform equally well. But in area with vegetation or larger frequent change, like here you see this agricultural region, coherence tend to drop very badly. And unfortunately, Solomon Island is one of the remote area with many, very few man-made structures. Those things tend to, like a rooftop doesn't tend to change over time, right? So those are good InSAR target. They don't have this kind of a stable target for surface deformation analysis. All they have are those tropical forests, dense forests that change all the time, that decorrelate the signal. So that's why the C-band sentinel data doesn't work very well here. But luckily, all results shows you can retrieve a very coherent measurement from L-band ALOS data, which is actually promising given that we have L-band and InSAR data coming this year. So a lot of the result here we are showing later on the same analysis process can be actually applied to InSAR data. So the second kind of a noise is that we also have this tropospheric noise. So what are the tropospheric noise? The tropospheric noise are introduced usually by this variation in water vapor. And so if you have a cloud on the top of UT, there's no cloud in San Antonio, right? And that kind of fringes will kind of show up in interferogram. So there are usually two types of component. So the first one is correlated with topography. And so usually if you have a tall mountain, the tropospheric delay you see over the integrated path to the top of the mountain going to be less than what you see from all the way to the foothill of the mountain, right? So there's a topography-related component, and this component can be typically predicted reasonably well with the global weather models because they're topography dependent, water vapor, temperature dependent. Another thing that I think usually become a major issue is this a random tropospheric noise that tends to be random over uncorrelated in time over an hour of 6 hours. So just those localized structure that come and go. So that become a problem. Depending on where you are, Solomon Island is a tropical island. So it's actually a little bit of a bad in terms of tropospheric analysis. You're talking about 5 centimeter up to even 10 centimeter of a tropospheric noise. So that's a major problem. So as we look into the ALOS data, because I mentioned the C-band data, we looked at it. There are some hope, but I would say our team is specialized for densely vegetated area. We recently made a Sentinel data works for the Gulf Coast where we have a lot of trees. But Solomon Island is super hard. It's still like somehow looks worse than the coastal island near the Houston area, right? So that's why we initially focused on the ALOS data analysis. But the disadvantage of the L-band sensor, that's pretty much the only openly available L-band sensor, is that we only have about 10 acquisition total. It's a relatively short duration. The mission only lasts 3 years before it died, and it only have data every 46 days, and it have gaps in between, so you don't have a lot of data. And also tropospheric noise is very bad, right? And so in this kind of a case, what can you do to maybe tease out some deformation signal? So we have to look at it. So the very first thing we look at the data, we find, well, there's only 2 things happened quite before the earthquake. Unfortunately, when you form interferogram with one of them, it's all decorrelated. And why that day? Like my hypothesis with Lauren is that it's probably a super rainy day. Like there's a storm that day, get everything wet on the surface, and the surface scattering probably had changed on that day. That just decorrelate everything. So we end up with 1 SAR acquisition before the SAR things and 9 acquisition after. But usually through visual inspection, except for 1 or 2 things that seem to just decorrelate, right? And so the rest of them, the decorrelation was actually not bad, as I feared. So it's like just by looking at Sentinel, I was shocked just by switching a wavelength how much better that problem goes away. But the tropospheric noise becomes a prominent noise for the scenario. So if you're looking at what the tropospheric noise added into interferogram, here phi ij is an interferogram that using the SAR acquisition I and the SAR acquisition J, right? And so what's the signal under this assumption? Tropospheric noise is kind of the competing factor. So what are you measuring here after you do all the other subtraction and the correction, right? It's going to be the amount of deformation occurred between this date I and the date J in the line of sight direction, plus the tropospheric noise at day J minus the tropospheric noise at day I, right? So based on this formula, so I have a question here for you. What's the characteristic of the tropospheric noise in an interferogram, a stack of interferogram, by looking at that, right? And so, as I mentioned, one of the key property of the troposphere is that it's random in time. over the time interval 6 days. So whether it's rain today versus next week, there's no correlation. And those data are minimum time window is 46 days, right? So you can think about NJ and AI are random in time, but for each tropospheric noise, they're kind of correlated in space, right? Because the cloud, it doesn't just affect the pixel, it's gonna affect all the pixel under the cloud. So it's correlated in space, but random in time. So what's the characteristic of that if you see an interferogram? This means if you have an interferogram that formed using a particular SAR day, they're gonna have the same tropospheric noise component. And if that data was not used, and that feature will not be present. That doesn't work for deformation, right? But for the troposphere, so this noise is scene dependent. So if you're using that scene, that noise is going to be in that data set, right? So that's a very important characteristic. And so then let's look at the deformation signal. The way to kind of tease them out is really just trying to focus on how they are different either in time and in space, right? And for the postseismic deformation, we mentioned because the SAR was every 46 days, deformation happens within seconds to minutes, right? So it looks like a step function in our model. And so whenever you have a pair that spans the earthquake, you have the postseismic deformation. And for magnitude 8, that jump is too high. That's like the dominant term. You don't have to worry about noise. When you have 2 meters of a deformation, I don't think people care about the 5 centimeters of a noise there. The pattern is overall correct, right? So that's the case. But for the postseismic deformation, the signal tend to be the magnitude are much smaller, especially over a smaller time window because they tend to happen over a longer period of time. So a lot of the time, this characteristic of a postseismic deformation can follow a model of a kind of a decay, right? So right after the earthquake, the rate tend to be larger, and over time, it starts to decay. And also it has an interesting, as it goes closer to the epicenter, the rate tend to be higher as you move away, right? And those signal tend to be a smaller magnitude. So that's a very, very different characteristic from the tropospheric noise. And by knowing those differences helps us to compare what we're seeing in the data and tease out which one are likely due to the signal from the postseismic period of deformation, and where it's purely just some rain cloud on a tropical island. So the way we do that for the postseismic deformation is that we tried several approaches. The first approach is to group those, we only have 9 acquisition, right? Group them with over 3 consecutive windows. So the very first window is 1, 2, 3, right? You have 3 dots, and you can form interferogram with 1, 2, 2, 3, and 1, 3, right? And so that's a group 1. And by using this information, and you can see, you can calculate the average deformation that occurred between those period of time by averaging the 3 InSAR observation. You can do the same thing for the period of 3 to 7 and 7 to 9. And we don't have a lot of acquisition here. So in that case, you could have just listed all the interferogram we use. And then based on this math formula, what each of the interferogram have, you can actually know for the first stack, what are the signal contribution, V1, that's the average velocity over the same first time window shortly after the earthquake, and the second window and the third window, and how the noise attribution are playing role. You can see because the first one, the noise on the day 2, because it used as a positive ones and negative ones, it's get actually canceled. So you end up with a residual noise for the first date and the second date, third date, right? And you have the same thing for the other one. And one of the interesting things for this stacking design, if you take a closer look, is that the stacking number 1 and the stacking number 3, they don't share any common SAR date. Right, so if you see a same feature that appear on both stack, it's not going to be due to tropospheric noise. Because the tropospheric noise is just, there's no way that tropospheric atmosphere are going to behave exactly the same, give you the same feature, right? And so for stacking number 1 and number 2, they actually share one feature. So if you see something that looks very similar from stacking number 1 and number 2, but with the opposite sign, that is actually the tropospheric noise on day 3. Because this contributes to a positive component, here it contributes to a negative component, right? And so just by the simple stacking, you can start to see the tropospheric noise already will, on different days, will play a different roles on the 3 different stacks. And on the other hand, for those three velocity, V1, V2, and V3, right, as it goes forward, we expect this kind of signal at a given pixel will decay in time. And we expect to see this velocity going to be larger as you closer to the epicenter. And let's see what the actual stacking result looks like. And here is ALO's stacking result. It's in line of sight, and it's right, and so it's mostly sensitive to horizontal east-west motion and vertical motion. So you can kind of think about the combination of the two. And so within this green marked box for the three stacking result over the three period, and you can actually see a very consistent spatial pattern. So that's on the island of Varna, really close to the epicenter, right? And so this over time, consistent feature kind of fade over time, fade very, very well with that postseismic deformation kind of a signal characteristic. And outside that area, and you can see, is indeed like there are some pattern, they looks like a blob, just like a deformation pattern, spatially correlated, right? From that perspective, it's hard to separate these two. But the pattern itself, where red is, they kind of just randomly show up here and there. They don't have a consistent pattern. So that is more close to resemble the impact of a tropospheric noise. Of course, this is just one stack, right? What if it's just our luck, it happened to look like that? But we can design alternative stack. So here is another alternative stacking criteria. And in this criteria, we kind of doing, instead of a consecutive time window, you can do a growing time window. So we start from the first acquisition day, and our first stack is just one interferogram using the two SAR acquisition, right, happened afterwards. We have one interferogram to SAR acquisition. It's going to be noisy because based on some GPS survey validation, the noise level is about 5 centimeters, right? So it's going to be a noisy measurement, but that's it. But then you can add one more such things, right? And an additional interferogram as if like the final one is going to have all 9 postseismic SAR acquisition. And the number of interferogram you can get is 9 choose 2. So that will be 10th of the interferogram total. And you can actually work out the mass formula based on what the tropospheric noise looks like in each interferogram. So what you will get, the very first term would be the average deformation within each time window, because you kind of average, all you do here is average all the interferogram and then scale by the total time that those interferogram spans, right? So stacking is very easy once you have the interferogram. So the very first term is the average deformation over each time window. And the second term here is the, go back. So the second term here, you can see that is a weighted sum of those tropospheric noise, and where W here is the weight, which has an analytical solution here. So for each given window, based on this, some of the noise get canceled out. So the largest noise is going to be the first day and the last day. That is going to have the largest weight, right? And so, because of all these different time windows, the last date was changing. So each of the stacks, the last date is changing, but the first date is persistent. For this design, the temporal stack, there are two things that might appear like a signal that is fading in time. One is the true postseismic deformation signal, and one is the tropospheric noise on that first day. Right? But you could rule out the tropospheric noise by doing a growing time window stack starting from day 2 as well. Right? So that's the idea. So interestingly, by doing this growing time window stack, you actually get a snapshot of what's the cumulative deformation that happens over time, right? And so you can see that very good that within the Varna island, again, this is a different scheme, so noise weights are different from our previous stack. That deformation, that fading signal on Varna, right, remain the same. So the rate initially become relatively large. It's the opposite sign of the coseismic deformation. So before it was the other direction. So they flip the sign, but then initially, and it just start to get fade over time, and the spatial characteristic was remained. Right, and so, but outside the window, you can start to see the noise are still kind of appear random over time. As the time window grow, because you start to have more interferogram, the total time span is long. You have a denominator here. That's why the residual noise also start to getting weighted down a little bit. By comparing these two different stacking design, and our conclusion here is yes, with limited L-band ALOS data, it's challenging to get a reliable deformation everywhere. But we are convinced over the Vona, that's the island closest to the epicenter, we were able to reconstruct a robust postseismic deformation solution over a period about 2 years after the earthquake. So it's quite a lot of work for just a small amount of a deformation over an area for 2 years, right? And so what about larger time windows? So study an earthquake cycle. There's usually a very long interseismic creeping period that can last for tens of years, right? And so with 3 years of satellite data, 10 interferograms, there's just no way to be able to go back in time and reconstruct what is happening before the earthquake, right? So that's a question on what can we get further and to assemble some additional information and to better understand the earthquake cycle. And that's the part I'm really excited about and learned about. And I thought it's very, very cool is that even before I joined UT, there has been, even in the 90s, they started to go to Solomon Island, this remote island. And this is, I believe, Fred. And looking at this coral that is staying there, and if you can get all those samples. So they're right now actually seated at the UTIG, one of the lab, like Luke has, right? So we have a lot of those coral samples. So why are they useful for surface deformation measurement? It turns out like this coral can only grow under the water, right? And so when there's an earthquake that has a huge uplift, those coral will be pushed above the surface, and anything above the surface would die. Anything below the water gonna continue to grow vertically and horizontally. So just to be able to track down, you can see this coral stop, like where this die down occurs. So this is actually a proxy of where the water level is, which is relatively sea level. And what changes the relative sea level? There is probably a global sea level rise signal from just the change of the absolute sea level. But more importantly, if you have a large tectonic signal that leads to subsidence and an uplift, that will be recorded here as well. And so that become a very useful living record of surface deformation happened at the subduction zone potentially over hundreds of years, because those corals, as far as I know, have been there thickly recording data for long before we know they're doing that, right? And so how does this work? So let's take a look at this slab. And so this is one of such data. So while you're seeing it just looks like a white slab, but once you do an X-ray scan, you start to see a lot of rings on this coral slab. And so each of these rings record 1 year of growth, because of the coral growth is influenced by sunlight, by the water temperature. So these has a very strong annual cycle. So they are like these tree rings that will grow with this ring-like feature. And given those tree rings, and you know when you are collecting it, if you could count those rings back in time, that allows you to resolve those recording when that year is with sub-annual resolution, right? Each ring is a year, so if you record, you measure the distance, you get a temporal resolution on the order of a couple months. And also by looking at the coral scans, so those green curves, so those are coral morphology, right? And measurement, so which is basically a record of where the water level is at that given year that corresponding to that ring. And there is a big drop here. It's because of that uplift leads to a large amount of coral. I think it's 73 centimeters of coral died. And so the new growth is gonna start at the water level right here. And so this was the old water level, and this is the uplift and the death, and this is the new water level. And that's the year 2027 from that Solomon Island earthquake. So when we have this, the coral morphology itself is already, like that highlighted in green, already very useful to kind of recording the historical large uplift event and some major subsidence event that will allow the coral to grow vertically up, right? And so it's very useful for that, not only for tectonic signal, but also for global sea level signal. But additionally, we can probably start to retrieve a smaller signal with more accuracy if we use something called a geochemistry analysis called a delta C13 analysis. It turns out when this coral grows, so they have a ratio that you could analyzed from their samples, so the ratio between delta C13 and delta C12. And so because of this ratio is influenced by temperature, sunlight, so they can be actually indirectly converted to water level. So that's a proxy of water level. So in order to establish that relationship, here what we did is along this 27 earthquake die down profile, vertically it's at a different depth. So you from A, B, C up to G, and you draw some like a yellow transect that is perpendicular to the rings, right? And so each of these tiny rings is about like 3 years of data. You draw multiple samples. You measure the delta C13 measurement. And because it's died down, you know the surface level, the total amount of uplift, so you know where they were before. And that allows you to establish a empirical relationship between the amount of delta C13 measured along with the water depth. And here is like each of the horizontal line is the samples are drilled with in each of this yellowed line, right? And clearly there are some variation of the samples, likely due to other factors like climate cycle and also influence the delta C13 and relative sea level. But clearly there's a linear trend that is associated with the water depth versus delta C13. And this linear relationship, this slope, allows us to translate this delta C13 measurement to relative sea level measurement. And it's actually, we're very happy about it because Luke said there are previous study established a very similar linear relationship here. It's just, it's another validation. This method indeed is working, right? And so for our study, I think relative sea level rise, they're a climate signal. They are very interesting. But for our purpose, we're solely interested in the tectonic component. In order to tease out this component, again, we can make use of the temporal and the spatial, the temporal differences in these, like those climate signals, they have an annual cycle. Usually we haven't seen the data, but that's what you would expect to see, right? And also they might have some signal related with the El Nino, La Nino. They're not totally predictable, but they might appear to be a little bit of cycle-like, right? And so those are climate signals, but besides, you would probably see uplift due to large earthquake and some of the interseismic trend that usually appear to be, there's like a stable linear like trend. So they have a different temporal characteristic that can help us to tease out these two components. So for people who focus on absolute sea level or tectonic signal. And another way to kind of tease out is you can compare with some tide gauge data. And usually those absolute sea level, they vary slowly in space. So two tide gauge data hundreds of kilometers away, they probably have a very similar absolute sea level, but their tectonic deformation influence is going to be more localized. And so by comparing these two, you could tease out the common component and focus on the tectonic analysis. Right, so we were very encouraged by this linear trend. So the next thing is mostly Memo is doing that. I think many, many hours of work. Sounds simple, we process something, but that's mostly Memo's work. It's like then we use this linear relationship, we kind of collect the most coral samples along this longer transect. Remember, each ring is a year. So this is about like almost 15 years of data span. And we measure the delta C13 measurement, and using this linear relationship, we can translate that to sea level rise. And then based on the tide gauge data, we remove the sea level, absolute sea level contribution, and isolate the tectonic deformation we attribute to the earthquake cycle signal. So here's what we get, right? And so after all those years of work, so this is the delta C13 relative sea level data. We already convert that to relative sea level, so it's no longer the geochemistry unit. And then on the other side is a tide gauge data that is far away to sense the same tectonic motion, but close enough to share the similar climate signal. So based on these two signals, not surprising, there are big annual cycles, right? So these are due to the sunlight and the temperature. There's a temperature cycle. And also there are some big dips in those tide gauge data, right? So those are El Nino event that leads to, that is actually pretty sensitive that you can record in some of this tide gauge data. But overall, if you look at the raw tide gauge data, there's no obvious uplift from the earthquake. So the earthquake signal is right here, That's 2007. That's a huge uplift that was recorded in the delta C13 measurement. You don't see that in the tide gauge data, right? And also, overall, you don't really see a very clear sea level rise in the tide gauge data. Why? Because there's a variation. It's on the order of 10th kilometer. Most of the time, there's a sea level rise signal, while very, very important, is usually on the order of millimeter level per year, right? And so that's why you don't see a clear sea level rise or decrease trend in this tide gauge data. But on the other side, if you take a closer look, so we filtered the delta C13 data on the left, that we're trying to remove those annual cycles that we're not interested in, right? And here you can see in this filtered coral data, you can see better that uplift signal related with the uplift due to the postseismic deformation. And prior to the earthquake, over the course of, I think, more than 10 years, since 1996, there is a clear long-term subsidence trend that occurs prior to the earthquake. And look, our team believe that is interseismic deformation related with this earth cycle, because this downward trend is not present in the nearby tide gauge data, right? And it's I think it's about 2.3 centimeter per year, if I recall correctly, right? So it's a centimeter level subsidence trend that lasted over 10 years, right, before the earthquake cycle. And also, one of the fortunate is our coral record actually also correlates, covers the postseismic period where we have the ALOS data. And you can clearly see this coral data shows that the postseismic deformation has the opposite sign. So during the earthquake data, there's an uplift, then it's kind of a decay, right? And that's exactly what we see in the InSAR data. And also, in order to kind of compare whether these two observations share consistent temporal kind of evolution. So here we plot the InSAR-derived postseismic deformation at Bona, right? We can only do that over that area. So we did an average over the Bona island. That's in blue. And also the red is the delta C13 relatively sea level time series. So they're on different scale, but you can see we cannot really do a direct validation because the InSAR measures line of sight and the coral measures the vertical deformation. And these two are at a slightly different location. So the coral only grow in the ocean. InSAR only works on land, right? And so they're at a slightly different location. But nonetheless, you can see their order of the amount of deformation. And like when the decay rate, these important characteristics are all consistent. And again, this really is a way to kind of confirm both approach, well independently processed, are likely capturing some common signal that occurred shortly after the earthquake. So here is my final slide. It's an ongoing project, and I think it take a lot of time for us to get here, get it funded, get students, get all the data analyzed, right? But it's going to be really cool because last year in July, as I mentioned, InSAR finally launched. They talk about launching it next year when I was a student. They talk about launching it when I was a postdoc. They talked about it when I was a assistant professor. Now I'm tenured, they finally launched it. So it's there. I was able, as a member in the InSAR science team, I was able to see some of the preliminary data. I think the mission is successful. The data will be available in spring this year. And remember, it's an L-band sensor, just like ALOS data. The difference is ALOS, we only have 10 things. And the InSAR, it will deliver 30 things every year, right? And so with that, with all those different combinations, you will have significantly advanced your ability to characterize the surface deformation over this region. And along with the already selected planned ROSEL L-band and InSAR mission that will be launched in 2028, I'm hoping we're gonna, over time, with decades of InSAR surface deformation data that can span an earthquake event as well. Right, and so that's the good news for InSAR side of work. ALOS shows L-band works great here. We're just going to have just like L-band ALOS data, but much better, right? And so that's exciting. And another side, like we mentioned, we have a lot of those coral slab analysis. So Mammal was able to, you can see the transect edge was relatively short over that entire transect. And recently, with the MAMMO's work, we were able to extract the delta C13 analysis over that same coral slab over a longer transect, was able to reconstruct the surface deformation history at that site over hundreds of years. And that was able to capture like a lot of the historical event, right? And our preliminary result already showed there were very interesting signal in this longer record. And here we are showing Luke is really leading the effort. He's working there on this coral in the lab, and I'm very happy to help when they need an extra hand. But with all this diligent work, I believe we will have a lot more coral data, a lot more good InSAR data. And together, they really will form a very complementary observatory over this region that we have very little knowledge, and that's very active. So that's the end of my talk. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anne, for a great presentation. Time for a few questions. We're running a little bit late, so people should feel free to step out if you have to go. Waiting for questions. And when you do the atmospheric stuff, can you use GPS, total electron content, to correct?
Oh, so for ionophoric stuff, usually you can kind of compare with the GPS data. Here is mostly tropospheric noise.
Okay.
Because we have looked at ionophoric, they usually have a very distinct characteristic. So we believe this is more tropospheric noise. So the GPS,
Gotcha.
the TEC won't help. The problem we couldn't use the GPS to validate the data is there's only 3 GPS stage.
Yeah, but given it's spatially correlated, right, it might still give you something. But if it's a different part of the atmosphere,
right? But they kind of vary very quickly in space. So if you
Okay.
only have one measurement, it doesn't seem to work. Yeah.
Are you able to estimate the tropospheric noise from environmental data, such as meteorological data in the area?
For this area, based on this behavior and our preliminary analysis, looks like there's not a lot of a strong correlation with the topography because there are actually mountains there, things like that. So those patterns looks kind of more random in space. Looks like just some kind of moisture blowed from the ocean into inland, and the next day it's blown this way. So this kind of a turbulence noise. So this kind of a noise is very hard to predict with weather models. So we do have some InSAR tropospheric noise correction. And in area where you have a very large elevation drop, like 2,000 meters, with a lot of GPS data with zenith delay along with weather model. So those corrections are effective. Like we had a project with Daniel Truckman over Walkerlin. We see that's very promising. You can remove a lot of those components, but not those random component that kind of had a very small scale, like a 10 kilometer. Those weather models are a 5 kilometer scale. Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is maybe a question for both of you and Luke. The trend you get before the 2007 event is so large that this is presumably not a regular interseismic signal. Otherwise, you would have magnitude 8s all the time, right? So you think this is some sort of anomalous transient?
Large. So it's sorry. It's a very, very large signal. So we're kind of wondering, either the delta C13 versus the water depth is overestimating the signal, or it's a very anomalous signal and there's something local. But you have to realize the subduction zone is very heterogeneous. It's broken up in pieces. So maybe what you see is real, like there is some very localized deformation, and it locks locally. And there might be, in many cases, also other cores, we see before the earthquake, we see some deformation signal, some precursors, what you call precursors. Yeah. So
I mean, it's huge, right? Because it's like half of the co-seismic signal over.
Yeah. And it's really
10 years.
It's really, really fast. Yeah. So
it's not a cycle thing.
No,
right?
no. The cycle. I
I
understand what you mean. The cycle would be
much longer.
150 years.
That's right.
So, yeah. But the weird stuff is that in the cycle, so the data from Memo, I'm sure you've seen it. It sees, lots of ups and downs. So it's not what you expect, like some nice long, slow subsidence. It's like ups and downs. So it's weird. Yeah.
Questions for Anne? Chen.
Oh, hi, and thanks for the talk.
I'm a little bit curious about the tropospheric signal.
Mhm.
You see there's a robust signal in the west part, the reddish one.
So the red,
Yeah, this one.
which part?
Yeah, this one. This one's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. So the west part, the green rectangular one, you say it's a robust feature through all the stacking
Right.
stacks. How about the one in the southeast? There's also reddish one, I think, in all the stacks.
Oh, because this is a growing time window, right? And so the first day's noise will also persist over all the time. So in order to tease out what is a really consistent outside the green box, you have to kind of compare these two too. So these are from 3 different stacking windows. So basically, they should all contain a time decaying postseismic signal and some kind of a random tropospheric noise. But like you can see this red feature outside of the region, it's not persistent, it's not here, and right, it's not here. It
But the
is
thing in the
different.
southeast that Jung was talking
Yeah,
about is kind of
southeast.
there, right? You can see it in this plot too.
Southeast one. The small
Yeah,
part. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it.
this one.
This part,
Yeah, this one.
yeah, it's just not as prominent here. You can see it's not here, right?
I guess related to this, if you model the M8 with a simple deformation model, what should this look like?
We haven't done that. Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to do, but we also need to have the fault geometry to be able to do this kind of
Right, but you can make up something, it takes like 5 minutes.
There is a there is a 2010 earthquake occurring in the area where the southeast stuff is going on. So yeah, it's just going to 2010, you know.
Well,
and then we don't
right before that
right
earthquake, the
before that.
Alos
So
tide, yeah.
there is some strange transfer going on, and then boom, just south of that, there's a big earthquake, a 7.7, something like that.
Gotcha.
So I would say it's possible, but based on my experience, I would not overinterpret it just because from the 6-9 data set over that corner. I haven't seen a very
Sure, but
consistent.
without knowing what the single earthquake should look like, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to tell, how far does it reach? And if it's a thrust, it does these weird wiggles, right?
Yeah,
So
that's possible. It's just like we are kind of sure in the green box is doesn't look like tropospheric noise because it
Gotcha.
doesn't have the feature. Outside, it's a kind of an ambiguity zone. If you have prior knowledge, you can probably tease out even more. That's why there's the earthquake physics actually play a role. You can kind of help, but just from how the radar works alone, as a radar science perspective, I would say maybe it's noise. It's because they are really comparable magnitude.
Thank you. I have another question because I'm doing geodynamics and numerical modeling, and the plates actually themselves, if you view them as a rigid body, they can move relatively maybe 10 centimeter per year. This is pretty fast, like for Pacific plate. Does this kind of whole plate's horizontal motion affects how you measure the deformation on the ground?
So it depending on the spatial scale of this motion. So for those plate tectonic motion, I think they are kind of constant within an island. Probably their variation is over a larger spatial scale. So one key important feature of InSAR is GPS measure absolute deformation over with respect to a reference frame. InSAR measures relative motion. So here, all the deformation is with respect to that diamond, the teal diamond there. So it doesn't know if the entire area is moving because they only know the relative change within that study period. So if you want to change it to a broader scale, then you have to usually use a GPS to ping those InSAR data over a reference frame. But some of the recent studies said if you have a large enough InSAR data, then you could actually capture those variation in plate tectonic motion. But that's going to happen in a much larger scale than tens of kilometers.
Okay, thank you.
Great, lots of food for thought. Let's thank Anne again for great presentation.